Dr. Evelyn Hart knew she should have turned down the offer. The facility, an unmarked building in the middle of nowhere, was too secretive, the funding too generous, and the questions too scarce. But the allure of working on the edge of scientific discovery was too tempting. When the government-backed project recruited her, they made their expectations clear. Push the boundaries of human potential. What they didn't say was at what cost. The lab was buried deep underground, accessible only through a secure elevator requiring biometric scans at every level. The air felt heavy, as if the earth above pressed down with a knowing weight. Evelyn joined a small, hand-picked team of scientists. Their focus? Experimentation on the mind, unlocking the untapped potential of the human brain. They called it Project Ascension. At first, the work was exhilarating. They explored ways to enhance memory, perception, and even telepathic communication. They mapped brainwave patterns, tested cutting-edge neural interfaces, and conducted experiments that would have been deemed unethical anywhere else. But as weeks turned into months, Evelyn began to notice cracks forming in their ethical boundaries. The subjects were volunteers at first, people desperate for money, soldiers seeking an edge, or terminal patients willing to gamble on experimental cures. But as the experiments grew more invasive, the pool of willing participants dried up. That's when the unwilling started arriving. Evelyn protested, but the project lead, Dr. Marcus Treadwell, dismissed her concerns. The ends justify the means, he would say, his tone as cold and clinical as the lab itself. We're unlocking the future of humanity. Evelyn's protests were met with veiled threats. She considered quitting, but knew the facility's location was classified, her every move monitored. She was trapped, just like the subjects. The turning point came with Subject 47. He arrived in restraints, escorted by armed guards. Young, wiry, and wide-eyed, he screamed profanities and begged to be released. The guards dismissed him as a mental patient, someone whose unstable mind made him ideal for their latest experiment. Evelyn wasn't so sure. Subject 47's name was Caleb. In the brief moments she spoke to him before the experiment began, he seemed lucid. "They're lying to you," he whispered, his voice trembling. "This place is wrong. It's not just science, it's something else. You'll see." Evelyn felt a chill, but said nothing. She had seen too much already to dismiss his words entirely. The experiment involved a neural interface designed to stimulate parts of the brain associated with higher consciousness. They hoped it would unlock new cognitive abilities. Instead, it unlocked something far worse. The moment the device activated, Caleb began to convulse. His screams echoed through the sterile lab, growing deeper and more guttural until they no longer sounded human. His body arched violently, the restraints digging into his skin. The monitors went haywire, spitting out data that defied explanation. "Shut it down," Evelyn shouted, but the controls were unresponsive. The machine seemed to have a will of its own, refusing to release its grip on Caleb. Then Caleb stopped moving. The silence that followed was suffocating. His eyes snapped open, and Evelyn gasped. His irises were gone, replaced by a swirling void that seemed to pull the light from the room. When he spoke, it was not his voice but a chorus of others, layered and discordant. "You have opened the gate," the voices said. "We are many. We are eternal." The lights flickered and the air grew cold. Evelyn felt a pressure in her chest, as if unseen hands were squeezing her lungs. The others in the room froze, their expressions blank and unseeing. Caleb's body began to rise, his limbs contorting in impossible angles. A dark, viscous substance oozed from his mouth and eyes, pooling on the floor in unnatural patterns. And then he screamed again, a sound so piercing it felt as though it would split her skull. The glass walls of the lab shattered, and the emergency alarms blared. Evelyn stumbled backward, her mind reeling. She had no idea what had just happened, but she knew one thing: Caleb was no longer Caleb. The facility went into lockdown. Armed guards swarmed the halls, their weapons trained on anything that moved. But Caleb, or the thing he had become, was gone. The cameras showed him wandering the lower levels, his movements erratic and unnatural. Wherever he passed, the power flickered, and strange symbols appeared on the walls, drawn in the same black substance that had poured from his body. Dr. Treadwell called an emergency meeting. His calm demeanor was gone, replaced by barely concealed panic. "We've made contact with something," he said, his voice strained. "Something beyond our understanding. We need to contain it." Evelyn wanted to scream at him, to demand why he hadn't listened earlier. But there was no time. Caleb's condition was spreading. The guards who encountered him began to change, their eyes darkening, their movements jerky and unnatural. They attacked without warning, their bodies contorting in ways that defied biology. It wasn't long before the lower levels were overrun. Evelyn worked frantically, searching for a way to shut down the neural interface. She believed that if they could destroy the machine, they might sever the connection to whatever force had taken hold of Caleb. But the machine seemed almost alive, its circuits pulsing with a strange, organic rhythm. Every attempt to disable it was met with failure. As she worked, the whispers began. At first they were faint, barely audible over the chaos, but they grew louder, more insistent, until they drowned out her thoughts. They spoke in a language she couldn't understand, but the meaning was clear. Surrender. She resisted, clinging to her sense of self, but the whispers were relentless, promising knowledge, power, and freedom from fear. She could feel them crawling through her mind, searching for cracks to exploit. When she looked up, she saw Caleb standing in the doorway. His body was a grotesque amalgamation of human and something else. His limbs were elongated, his skin darkened and stretched, and his mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. The void in his eyes seemed to consume the room. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his voice a distorted echo. "You've touched eternity, Evelyn. Why fight it?" She grabbed a scalpel from the desk, her hands trembling. "Stay back," she warned, though she knew it was futile. Caleb tilted his head, studying her with an unsettling curiosity. "You can't stop it," he said. "You can only join it." With a flick of his hand, the lights in the room shattered, plunging them into darkness. Evelyn felt a force slam into her, throwing her across the room. Her head struck the wall and the world blurred. When she awoke, the facility was silent. The air was thick with the smell of burnt metal and decay. She stumbled through the corridors, her mind a haze of fear and confusion. The walls were covered in symbols, glowing faintly in the dim light. The bodies of her colleagues lay scattered, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. She made her way to the control room, hoping to find some way to shut down the facility and contain the horror. But when she arrived, she found Dr. Treadwell, or what was left of him. His body was fused to the neural interface, his flesh merging with the machine. His eyes were wide, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. The machine pulsed around him, its tendrils spreading like veins through the walls. Evelyn approached cautiously, her breath hitching. As she reached for the controls, Treadwell's head snapped toward her. His eyes, now identical to Caleb's, locked onto hers. "It's too late," he said, his voice distorted. "We are one now." The machine roared to life, its light blinding. Evelyn screamed as she felt herself being pulled toward it, her body and mind unraveling. The last thing she saw was the void, infinite and all-consuming. Days later, a cleanup team arrived at the facility. They found no survivors, only a labyrinth of twisted metal and cryptic symbols. The neural interface was gone, along with any trace of Caleb or Evelyn. The project files were sealed, the facility erased from existence. But the whispers remained. They lingered in the minds of the cleanup crew, faint and insidious. And as they left the site, one by one, they began to change.